We'll start the recording and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our fourth education policy brown bag and the last one of the fall semester of 2022. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Richard Blissett, who is an assistant professor of educational policy in the Department of Lifelong Education Administration and Policy at the University of Georgia. He holds a PhD in leadership and policy studies with a minor in quantitative methods from Peabody College at Vanderbilt University, as well as a BS in bioinformatics, I think I pronounced that right, and computational biology with a minor in computer science. When I was putting this together, I didn't know all these things about you, Dr. Blissett, from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He received the Peabody Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Leadership Award and was a fellow in the Cal Turner Program for Moral Leadership in the Profession. Not only is Dr. Blissett well accomplished and has quite the pedigree, he also has published in very high impact education and education policy outlets, including Educational Policy, Economics of Education Review, and Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. And as I like to always brag to my grad students, whenever there is someone who is both accomplished and really kind, I also try to point that out, at least from what I know. Dr. Blissett is a very generous, kind human being. We met as part of the ARA Division L's Program Planning Committee, which was a blast. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Blissett, and you're welcome to correct anything you want about your bio when you introduce yourself.
Yeah, as long as no one asks me anything about biology or chemistry, because I can't answer any of those questions. It is good to see all of you. It's wonderful to be here to chat about some of the research that we're doing. In addition to kind of what had been mentioned already, I'm also the principal coordinator for the Justice Education Policy Program, and mostly I say that because we'll probably hear about it within the next couple months as we open up applications for that for our next summer. And then I'm also in charge of kind of our equity politics research group. And so for the talk for today, I'm going to talk through some of kind of what we're working on to give people kind of an introduction to, what it means to kind of think about the politics of policy, but kind of from a very in your head kind of way. We often talk about politics and policy in this very large structural way, which is important, right? Not discounting that perspective. But this perspective is, I think, a little bit downplayed in some of what we do. And so I hope to kind of give a bit of an introduction to that also incorporates in some of the work we're doing to do that. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Also, do let me know if at any point you can't hear me or if it doesn't look like I'm moving because my internet sometimes has some issues. So just let me know. I'll be mostly monitoring the chat as we go along as well. All right, are you able to see kind of my slide view? All right. So again, what we're going to be talking about is personal politics, right? Whenever we talk about politics, we often think about big P politics, Congress, the courts, and the presidents, and all of that. But we also want to be able to think about personal politics too, which is the politics of the everyday, the politics of what you all are thinking inside your heads about how you choose to engage with education policy. And as you may know, the personal politics of educational equity and justice is a lot of where I focus on these days. And there are a lot of different ways in which this has been very important throughout U.S. history. If we're talking about, what we would consider to be quote unquote equity relevant policy, there's everything ranging from affirmative action to desegregation to critical race theory to culturally responsive teaching to Title IX, right? There's a whole range of things that are there. And as you may or may not know, generally have been very controversial, right? And generally have sparked a lot of debate, and many would argue have been some of the primary drivers of a lot of how we think about American politics in general, not just, education specific, but these things then end up kind of spreading across the way that we form our idea of what just American politics are, right? And again, as I said before, they're structural perspectives. And again, those are very important. I've done some of these that focus on social movements, focus on political parties, focus on interest groups and all of that. And all of this is really, really important. But the other side of the house are those perspectives that focus more on and use perspectives more so from social and political psychology that focus really on what people believe, why, and what kind of actions lead from those beliefs. And I don't do all of these things, but just as I'm always kind of like recruiting people into this field. Essentially, I want to like point out like the kinds of questions that people ask about policy all the time, particularly the ones you ask when you're probably feeling a little in your feelings about what's going on in policy, are very much kind of like the things that we care about within this field. So whether or not we're talking about what's going on in New York with Asian American activism, both for and against some of the policies up there, what does feminist identity mean for the kinds of policies that people tend to endorse? When we're talking about charter schools, that was a lot of what my dissertation was, what do we understand about like how do people feel about charter schools and why, and how people come to understand those things? What kind of information do people use? There's so many open questions in this area that are really about like what is going on in people's heads, in their interpersonal relationships, and in kind of the ways that they engage with politics that are really, really important for what politics and policy actually end up being. And so for the research that we do, and by we, I'm primarily referring to my research group, we have these days are focusing kind of in a few areas here. One generally are kind of attitudes towards race consciousness and related policies, which includes kind of these anti-divisive concepts, critical race theory things right now. It includes race conscious admissions and affirmative action, and also some general race and income targeting, which I'll talk about. We also do some stuff relating to particularly recent legislation and not so recent legislation having to do with rights towards transgender students, so particularly bans on sports participation for transgender girls, as well as some of the kind of more general educational policies related to kind of the experiences of transgender students. And then throughout all of this, in order to kind of move our work forward, we try to make sure we also think a lot about like our methodology. And so we also do some work kind of around quant crit methods, as well as some a synthesis between kind of what we understand about the thinking about justice in methodology and very long-standing traditions in other fields, particularly like qualitative methods. So in order to kind of frame this, we're going to talk really about the race consciousness part of this. And I think it's just important to first start off when we talk about this by just trying to put some definitions around just what race consciousness is, right? Because we say race consciousness, you have to think about race and policy and all of that as if it's a very simple thing, but it's not, right? And what it actually means and how it actually manifests itself can be very divergent depending on what we're looking at. And so for us, when we say race consciousness for us, we're largely referring to like two separate things that overlap, right? Where there's race consciousness in intent of a policy, where a policy in explicit intent, either in discourse, in legislation, in community action, in activism, in all of these spaces has an intent to address racial injustice and racial inequality, either historical or contemporary, and or race consciousness in design. And by this, we are talking about policies where explicitly in like the way the policy works, it requires at some point the assessment or the use of kind of race in the way that it is administered. So affirmative action is an example of this. Desegregation is an example of, well, if we're talking about desegregation, say by like race conscious student assignment policies, for example, right? Like you need to understand race in order to literally do the policy, right? Because like it's a part of the policy design. And notably, these are not necessarily the same. So for example, up in New York, the policy proposal that was being talked about there in terms of getting rid of the SHSAT, which is a standardized test used for specialized high school admissions in New York City. Many people have grouped that into race conscious, into like the race conscious policy world, even though technically speaking, that policy in and of itself doesn't include race and design at all. But the intent, as communicated by the mayor, by the chancellor at the time, was very much around like kind of increasing diversity and all of that. And that's why, a lot of the subsequent political reaction has been, related to that. Whereas, as an example, on the other side, Texas has a policy, the top 10 policy in Texas, right, that many people would consider to be race neutral, even though technically speaking, it has the same exact design as what is being proposed in New York. But the reason that it's considered race neutral in Texas is because it was developed specifically as a contrast to affirmative action, right, where affirmative action was the race conscious design, which is all to say that like our definition of like what is race conscious is not simply a design or intent thing. It's a combination of the both, right? In terms of like, it is in one of these spaces and it is contextualized in history. And there's so many examples of what we might consider to be race conscious policies that are very, very diverse in terms of how they actually work, ranging from financial reparations, mentoring programs on colleges and universities that are group specific, the renaming of high schools and buildings on college campuses, particularly over the past several years, away from, to like reduce the naming based on Confederate monuments, implicit bias training, a lot of these types of things. And as mentioned, these are very consistently controversial, often protested against, and pretty much as soon as they are raised in legislation, often are brought to courts pretty quickly, right? And as a bit of evidence for this, this is where we're going to flip into one of the studies we have, where just kind of descriptively, we want to be able to kind of show you what we're talking about here. So for one study we have kind of this, this study, frankly, is not where I want to spend most of our time during this conversation, but I do want to like pass through this study as context for the next one, is that, we're trying to understand, how people think about race conscious policy design. And so we have a design here where we have a total of 300 something people, 324 is on the slide. I know how to read. We have a total of like 324 people, and we have this within person experimental design. So what we do is we present people with a series of 10 policies. Each person gets all 10 policies, but for each one of those policies, it is randomly flipped out who that policy is targeted for, whether or not it's a universal policy, whether or not it is targeted to Black and African American students and or families, or for low-income students and or families, right? So here's an example, where we have one policy that is like, would you support, the creating scholarships to make college tuition more affordable? But within each person, within each policy, it flips out kind of what the targeting is, right? Does that make some amount of sense? All right. And just descriptively, again, we don't want to spend forever on this one, but descriptively speaking, what we find is pretty consistent with a lot of what we've talked about, is that when we look at kind of support for these policies, generally speaking, there's some variation in terms of whether or not there's actually any difference between people's support for universal policies or income targeted policies, but pretty much across the board, there tends to be reduced support for race targeted policies, particularly for your higher education policies, but also for your K-12 policies. And this has been consistent across the board. We have like more complex models kind of parsing out these various things as a function of demographics and all of that, but this is a pretty consistent result, both in the literature and also across our empirical analysis here. Further, we also find that and part of the reason we do this kind of within person design is so that we can identify kind of different effects for each person, or that effect of race targeting can vary across individuals. And we find there's actually quite a lot of variation, right? And this is one of the important notes that we're going to kind of see as a theme throughout this conversation, is that while it's easy to kind of like paint these broad-based pictures of how people feel about policy, what we want to be able to do is like tease that apart a little bit to give us a better sense of kind of like what is our democratic possibility across individuals, not just saying like, this is what America does, because we understand that like those of us who are doing activism work, advocacy work, we're often like working in ways that are much more on an individual level, right? And being able to understand that at an individual level is useful. So, first of all, for this particular thing, we find out quite a bit of variation across individuals in terms of whether or not race consciousness dampens their support. There are some people where race consciousness increases their support, and some people where it decreases their support. And so this opens up the possibility for us to do some deeper modeling on that, which one of my lovely grad students is doing, I think tomorrow. And then also we have planned for us to be able to do some deeper qualitative investigation where we like split the sample and like do some purposive sampling across the board for people who are like really into race conscious policy to people who are very against, and kind of be able to do some deeper analysis there. Now, one of the things you may identify, however, is that one of the downsides of the quantitative method, downsides, limitation, however you want to put it, right, is that we're not really getting into the ideology, right? We can see these kind of descriptive results to identify, what are the differences here, but we're not really getting into the why. And the whys are often very important for people who are doing various types of work as well. And so what I'm going to flip this presentation into now is for us to talk a little bit about some of this why part. Because I can understand that, like, those are probably, I don't know about more, but at least like substantively interesting questions that people want to know the answers to in order to figure out, like, how do I advocate for justice and equity? How do I deal with my uncle at Thanksgiving, right? How do I kind of think through some of these really difficult problems here? And so before we go into our study, I do want to lay out that we're not the first to do this, right? We exist, as many do, kind of within a lineage of research that asks these type of questions. And I frame it this way just because I'm, like your lovely professor here, I am also a reviewer for many things. We just had to review way too many things for this conference. And I think that there's increasing interest in these types of questions. But what we are finding, at least for those of us who are in this field, is that many people who are entering this work really don't have a sense of kind of like what has been done. And there are some good reasons for that. One, we never talk about it. We never like really teach it in politics of ed classes. And then further, like, there's also this practical limitation, which is that much of the work that has been done in this area has been done by social and political psychologists who are not in ed schools, right? And so a lot of what they publish is kind of over there, right? And so unless you're following those journals, it's actually pretty possible that you could just completely miss that area, right? It's also hard to find because sometimes for us, if I'm doing a study on affirmative action, I'll probably write affirmative action somewhere in the title or in the abstract, whereas a political scientist might not do that because the specific policy itself is like not their focus. It is like the political perspective on said policy, right? And so like there's just some like practical limitations to find it. So I want to shortcut some of that for you by just laying out kind of like, okay, what are like kind of the main things that we understand, the main perspectives that we talk about in terms of why people would resist race conscious policy. And again, not kind of like the big P politics version, but the little p politics version based off of social and political psychology. And there are three big categories here. The first category is called symbolic racism. The second is called self or group interests. They're technically a little different, but we'll group them for the purpose of this conversation. And the third one is called race neutral egalitarianism. And don't worry, I'm going to walk through each one in a little more detail, but these are kind of the main ones. And I list them out first because there is a disclaimer that I think is really important to put in before we go into the next parts, because psychology research is like notoriously misused. And so there are some disclaimers I want to give before we actually talk through each one of these. The first is that these are not intended to be diagnoses, right? This is not something where you're going to sit down with your sister-in-law and go like, oh, I know what's wrong with her, right? Like that's not what these are used for, right? This is meant to like just be providing some like frameworks to think about like kind of the ideologies that people hold. They're also not intended to be completely static, right? It's not that like one person fits in one bucket or another. You may be thinking in one frame one day and a different frame the other day, right? Like the way that we think is highly a function of our environment, of our emotions, of our context. And so like, it's not so much supposed to be like, you are a symbolic racist. Like that doesn't make sense in the context of how this theory actually works. And then the last thing is that these are not intended to be completely separate from each other, right? They're very clearly different in terms of like what they imply about cognitive behavior, in terms of what they apply about emotions and feelings and socialization, but they're all related, right? And that one could lead to the other. Some of them have joints and shared kind of roots. And so I just want to kind of lay that out because it's a thing that without this disclaimer, I think could lead people to like maybe the wrong conclusions about how we're separating these three. Sound good? So let's step through each one of them, right? Just to kind of give people an introduction to what this is. So the first one is often known as symbolic racism, often known as kind of like the older one in this field, emerging kind of post-civil rights movement. And the whole idea behind symbolic racism which isn't just about Black folks, but also extends to other areas as well, is that people's support for a policy that is helping a particular group may be attributed to whether or not people feel that said group deserves advancement, period, right? Symbolic racism is kind of born out of this idea that people have been socialized within a system that sends them consistent messages about who different groups are and what groups mean, and that at a certain point, for certain people, you may develop certain stereotypes, beliefs about a certain group that would change your policy opinions, right? So, or in other words, if there is a person who resists race-conscious policy, it may be the case that some of this time that may be a function of inherently not feeling that the beneficiaries of these policies deserve to have those benefits, right? This is a little, I wouldn't say difficult to think about in the area of race. Like it's actually frankly not that difficult to think about in the area of race, but one of the areas where I would say it's even clearer is that a very similar thinking often comes up in like LGBT politics, right? Where it's like policies that are meant to like benefit LGBT individuals, people's feelings about them may simply be a function of like, do you think that LGBT people like deserve kind of like the benefits of government and society, right? And like the same thing kind of happens here. And what's really important about symbolic racism is that it often posits that like where this kind of belief systems comes from is from like a long history of socialization within our system, right? From like the time people enter school, from the time they're interacting with their families, like they are consistently faced with messages that develop within them certain kinds of belief systems about populations, right? That's the symbolic racism perspective. There's a lot of theoretical and empirical work kind of supporting and kind of debating this, as you can imagine, in any theoretical area. The second one is generally about groups and self-interest. The main idea here, this is kind of the more, I don't know if rationalist is the right word, but it is kind of like the quote unquote logical one, which is basically saying that it takes as given at point A that human beings tend to put themselves into groups, right? There's a lot of social psychology research that kind of talks about, what is it, group identity theories and all of that, about like how people tend to put themselves together, and that race conscious policies may invoke for people the idea that the advancement of one group is going to result in changes in the status of life for other groups, right? So for white Americans, for example, the advancement of Black Americans, if we're thinking about any number of policy things, that it might result in some maybe changes in what white Americans have access to. Now, these perspectives are not saying that assessment that is what is going to happen is like true or not, right? It's not about whether or not it's true or not. That's not the point. But if someone feels that way, then there's the idea that people may resist policies that are race conscious because they are concerned, worried, frightened, whatever you might classify it as, that it will spell out kind of changes in their own status, their own resources, etc. Which frankly, this is a social psychological perspective. For any of you who are familiar with kind of like critical race theory, this is like not that different with from some of like the interest convergence theory from Bell and others, right? Though certainly this is taking like a much more psychological angle on that one. So that's the second one. The third one is the one that people talk about quite a lot these days, which is known as race-neutral egalitarianism. It's also sometimes known as principled conservatism or non-racial attitudes. There's a lot of names for it, right? This one's a little more complicated, but it is the one that people have found pretty consistently in a lot of like modern discourse, which is that it kind of takes as given a few things. One, it takes as given that individuals are the primary determinants of their circumstances, and we should primarily be treating people in that way, right? What people may know as individualism, right? The idea that like people are primarily responsible for their own circumstances, which on the flip side tends to dismiss structural influences on people's lives, right? Tends to, kind of, when we talk about racism as a structural thing, when we talk about sexism as a structural thing, tends to kind of reject those kind of perspectives as being overly important for the ways that people actually experience life. And therefore tends to see inequality primarily as kind of individually sourced, right? Like the differences that exist between different groups are coincidentally or, essentially a function of like the choices that individuals have made and, often framed as like bad choices, right? this is all kind of overlapped with like a long history of people's idea of fairness as being everyone is treated the same, right? Equal opportunity is like the ultimate vision of what justice means, even though for those of us in the field, we know there's a lot of different iterations of what this means. And like, these are not necessarily all the same. And so what this means is that like race conscious policies feel like for these people a violation of that individualism and a violation of fairness as defined by equal opportunity, right? Which some people call it non-racial. When we say that, we don't mean it is not related to race and racism. Like, that's not what we mean by that. What we mean is that like inherent in the cognitive layout of what is here, it is not necessarily just about kind of like feelings about a specific racial group. It is about kind of like the idea of like what fairness means in government and policy in general, right? Now, again, like these are all related. These are all complicated. These shift a lot. These mean different things to different people at different times, right? But these are kind of the large buckets we talk about. And the reason I raise this is because this kind of ties into some of the big sticky questions that people are thinking about these days around like what's happening right now. Because we are in a, I'm not going to say unique moment, but we are in a moment, to say the least, right? Where the politics of race conscious policy are, I mean, they've always been around, but now they are like very front and central in our American politics with, you know, everyone from school boards to governors to presidents running on the basis of what they're going to do about kind of race conscious policy in the United States. Particularly one of the big things is kind of this anti-CRT movement, where we do have to, you know, of course, make the disclaimer that like CRT as defined in the legislation that we're talking about here is like not the same as CRT as defined by those who developed or used CRT, but it's at least called, you know, like CRT legislation. So I just want to, we get it. Like when we use that terminology, we're using it, you know, to refer to what the legislation is. And so to end our talk today, I want to kind of give you a preview of what we've been doing on that side of the house, where we have been trying to better understand kind of what people feel about this legislation and why. And specifically when we say legislation, we are focusing on a federal piece of legislation, which is important to us for a couple of reasons. One, we want to focus on something that is actually happening in specific, right? You know, one of the problems with a lot of public opinion polls is they ask things kind of in abstract, right? And we want to ask about like, this is a real thing that is happening, which is the Stop CRT Act. This is a proposal from Tim Cotton to ban CRT in schools. And by CRT, not CRT as we would define it kind of in scholarship, but kind of this more broad-based idea of these like 6 bullet points that we're not going to go through here, but folks in this room are probably like somewhat familiar with what some of those bullet points may be. Which means that like not only can we kind of look at people across the board, right, tied to the specific piece of legislation, but we are also tying in people's senses of governmentality. And by that, we mean like people's ideas of what government should or should not be doing. And so really briefly, and just because I want to make sure there's also some time for questions afterwards, this is a mixed methods design where we have a pretty basic kind of quantitative descriptive analysis where we are surveying people across the United States to gauge their opinions and predicting those opinions from kind of demographic characteristics, which we're not going to talk about as much here because it's probably the slightly less interesting part of this. And then we've also been doing interviews over time with folks who are kind of across the spectrum for how they believe about these things. Now, one of the things that's really important about kind of our methodology here, particularly on the qualitative side of things, is that we are not going into this with the intention of like pushing people, right? That's actually not our design at all. We're very much using kind of a dialogue plus therapy version of interviewing, which is a lot of what interpretive interviewing is, but that's often how I explain it to people, to really kind of like let people make their meaning with us, no matter what it is, right? Which is important to us because even if someone has opinions that we might consider to be like super, super different from our own, we still really need to understand them for the purpose of this study. So if you go through any of our interviews, which I mean, you can't because IRB, but were you to go through any of our interviews, you'd see like we're actually talking relatively little. And a lot of our framing is about really just about like getting people to tell us their stories. Hopping through maybe some of the quantitative stuff, because I am kind of keeping a look at time here. Hopping through some of our quantitative stuff, the major highlights from some of our quantitative analysis is that we just do have quite a bit of variation for people across like how they're supporting or opposing this bill. It is important to remember, because there's a lot of double negatives in this study, that people who support the bill are people who are supporting a ban, whereas people who are opposing the bill are people who are opposing a ban. So just keep that in mind. And particularly one of the things we've been really trying to parse out, particularly this is really important when you're doing studies of citizens, is that getting people's like strength of opinions and strength of feeling about bills and whether or not they like care enough to do anything about it is a really, really important thing, right? And this is pretty common across political science research, because when you look at polarization, when you look at like the fights that people have about policy, it can lead people to believe that everyone just feels really strongly about all policies. When what's actually true is like most people feel like kind of about a lot of policies, right? And it's like worth making sure you can distinguish on that basis when you're doing research. And so here, you know, our sample is more people who are opposing these bills than people who support. But even within each group, we're still finding there's quite a bit of variation for whether or not people would be likely to even vote on it if it was put to a vote, where there's a non-negligible proportion of people who are really not likely to vote on it at all if it comes up on both sides, and then quite a few people who are in the middle saying like, like if it comes up, like I'm somewhat likely, but I'm not like real gung-ho about it, right? Again, a really important thing to kind of think about in the personal politics of policy. Again, kind of just breezing through some of the quantitative stuff. Some major predictors of policy opinions are probably not that surprising to people who have been involved in this area. You know, people who identify as middle or upper class, more supportive, but people who are less supportive, somewhat predictably, Democrats and independents, liberals and moderates, compared to respectively Republicans and conservatives, women, Black people, and Latinx people. And particularly what's been notable about a lot of our quantitative studies is that like the strongest predictors, both in terms of variation in the outcome and magnitudes of the coefficients, have tended to be your political variables, particularly like liberal and conservative identity, even over kind of like racial identity and all of that. And it's from this that we've then sampled individuals and developed our qualitative design. So first of all, in terms of the interview protocol, you know, we made sure to include questions in the interview protocol that got a sense of whether or not these various kinds of predictors were a part of people's experience. And we also made sure that when we were sampling individuals, that we sampled people that represented a diversity among all of these characteristics here. This is where the mixing happens in our mixed methods, right? So that we are able to actually learn from the quantitative study in order to design a qualitative study that is able to be a bit more robust than it would have been just kind of at baseline. The other important thing to note about our sample right now, I'm not going to go through our sample characteristics right now. I can talk about them later, but one of the things that we are going to be doing is that we are going to be expanding our sample quite a bit because our sample right now is primarily people of color on both the support and opposition side, where we have mainly Black and Latinx individuals and some Asian individuals on one side and the same on the other side. That was somewhat on purpose at first because we were concerned that this particular population would be harder to kind of get interviews from. Turns out we were wrong about that. It was actually super easy to get interviews with this particular group of people. And frankly, we had too many, and that got very stressful for a little bit when we were doing scheduling. Overall qualitative results is that for folks who are supporting these bans, kind of the major kind of thematic analysis we've done at this point has identified kind of 4 large buckets, which we're still kind of like working through to see whether or not there's some like more important things that we should pull out here. The first being colorblind racial attitudes, or a lot of kind of very strong assertions from this group that, you know, for example, from one person that they were raised to believe that you judge each person on the basis of their individual merit, regardless of the color of their skin, which this very much is similar to some of like the race neutral individualism, egalitarianism we were talking about. There also was quite a bit of raising of like this parental rights thing, where a lot of people who were supporters often tended to simultaneously express a lot of dissatisfaction with the extent to which they felt like parents had a say in terms of what was happening in public schools. Then the other two were probably the place where there was like a lot more action. When we talk about individualism, again, kind of the same thing. We had two kind of things that were coming out here. One is a lot of the idea that individual white people should not be held responsible for what has happened in the past, and they see this bill as something that is preventing that kind of interpretation of slavery. So, you know, for example, saying, you know, just because I do something doesn't mean that every other white person has, you know, done or should be guilty of the same thing, right? And so, kind of very much individualism, but in terms of the assignment of blame was a really big thing. And then also some related to like colorblind racial attitudes, believing that kind of talking about race, categorizing by race, thinking about race, or what they believe critical race theory is doing. Again, importantly, not what it's probably actually doing, but what they believe critical race theory is doing is not treating individuals as individuals, but just as part of a group. Now, notably, one of the big things that come out of this, and actually all of our studies, because we're doing all these simultaneously, and this is a pretty common thing to come up, is there's a significant amount of ambivalence, right? A lot of people who often don't really know what to make of it. Like they support it, but they're also like, confused is not the right word, but ambivalent about like how they should feel about it, right? We're all kind of in ed policy. So we, you know, even if this is not our field of study, we probably know more than the average person about like what's going on. There are a lot of people who know way less, right? And where our interview with them was like one of the first times someone's ever like even brought up some of these things with them, right? And so a lot of people just feeling like, I don't really know what to make of it. I'd have to look into it. And then in particularly this is where governmentality comes in, quite a few people saying like, I support it, but like maybe not like this, particularly because a lot of people particularly conservatives, do not believe that the federal government and the state government should have anything to do with curriculum, right? Which is why we are very careful when we say like anti-CRT ban, that does not mean pro-CRT, because some of these people are just anti-bans, right? And so like that kind of distinction is really, really important. And then finally, on the other side, we have the people who are opponents of the bill. And this is the part we are hoping to finish up kind of soon before we expand our sample to go and refresh. One is that many people do have substantive interests in kind of what curriculum is, and believe that like it's not about kind of resisting the ban, but more saying like, no, children should learn X, Y, and Z about history. Children should be exposed to these kinds of conversations. So these people had what we would consider to be more affirmative beliefs about what they believe children should be learning regarding history and racism and all of that, and believe that this bill is kind of stepping backwards from the progress that they believed is important for American schools. On the other side, this particular group of people, we detected and observed a lot more strong frustration with the politics of the situation. You know, this is not to say that there wasn't, you know, kind of emotionality and all of this on the other side, but there's a lot more consistent kind of direction of emotionality on this side in terms of people just feeling that this is a political tool, it's a waste of legislation, that we have more important things to be focusing on, which again is not saying that they are like on board with CRT. It just means that they like are not on board with this being a thing we're talking about, right? Which again is an important distinction. And then of course there's kind of this middle kind of criticism that we have put together because they are related to each other. The point A being that like political elites and politicians are misinforming people, are brainwashing people, are using this to, as some would say, like Black people are being used as pawns to elicit a fear response. And then on the other side, identifying that they feel that many people who are supporting these bans are misinformed, uninformed, don't really know what's going on, and therefore are just kind of hopping on this particular bandwagon. So to close us out, so we can like open it up for questions, just so you know, these things are obviously not done. We've done like kind of the large majority of the work, but there's more work that needs to be done in this field in general. Regarding that first part I talked about a long time ago with the race and income targeting experiment, we're kind of doing a full assessment of kind of the demographic predictors of kind of where people are on the spectrum. And then we've identified some resources for us to be able to do some comparative qualitative study that follows up on people who exist kind of across the spectrum for how they react to race consciousness and policy. Regarding the Stop CRT stuff, as mentioned, we are expanding our sample. We had, and I don't know if this is surprising or not, but we had actually quite a bit of trouble getting our white respondents to show up to the interviews, which does mean that, ironically, our sample is underrepresented for white individuals. And so we're going to be kind of doing some stratified sampling to expand our inclusion of white individuals. The other thing that we have also noted, and this is something that we've known about, but that we think is really interesting to dig into, but does have kind of some practical implications, is that among people who support the bans, and again, we represent kind of a diverse range of backgrounds, and we are not pushing people in these interviews. Several of them, by the end of the interviews, kind of talk themselves out of supporting the bans, right? Just kind of gave them an hour. And by the end of it, they were like, actually, never mind, I don't really like it anymore, right? Which is, a very interesting thing. And for people who are interested in educational equity and justice is probably a positive thing, but does mean that we have fewer people in that bucket who at the end of the day kind of stuck to that belief. And we want to get some more for us to make sure that we have fully kind of saturated the experience on that side. And then finally, we also have some planned follow-up activities with some of these folks with some new folks and with some old folks, do a new interview where what we do is we present them with the found themes of the group that they were not in, to kind of do some dialogue work to kind of see how they react, see how they process it, see how they make meaning of the perspective that is not theirs. And so overall, kind of the purpose of this and a lot of what we're doing is identifying, how engaging with people's core ideological differences can be really, really important for understanding the ways that people feel about policy and what are kind of our possible levers for advocacy, dialogue, communication, and education are. The other thing that I think that we're able to do here that isn't as much in the literature, but we do think is like a really important thing here, is that there's a lot of diverse ways of thinking about opinions, right? Not everyone who supports a CRT ban supports it for the same reasons. Not everyone who opposes the CRT ban opposes it for the same reasons. And at the end of the day, you might say like, well, why does it matter? Their vote's going to be the same. It matters because the way I talk to them is going to be very different, right? And if you are an activist, an advocate, an educator, that is going to matter. And then further, one of the things we hope to be able to do is then test out some of these things as kind of like dialogue practice, right? There's a long history of dialogue practice that we are trained in and that we train others in, but seeing whether or not we can alter the ways that we do political dialogue and engagement in democratic politics that gives people the space to really kind of work out some of these things, because we're finding that just like the interview space itself, and this is kind of a thing we weren't expecting to find, just the interview space itself, many people tell us has been like just transformative in and of itself, to give people the space to kind of like work through it and really think about like kind of what they're doing, which we found in both this project as well as the project we're doing on the rights of transgender students. So I know I just blew through a lot, but the purpose of this was to kind of give you kind of a relatively like shallow look at kind of what is the range of things that we might be thinking about when we're looking at the personal politics of policy. And I'll stop from there.
Thank you, Dr. Blissett. I will open up the floor for questions. I have lots prepared myself, so please don't be shy, because otherwise it's just going to be me talking the whole time. Any questions?
Yeah, and I do see there's one in the chat from Emmy, which says, I wonder how background and life experiences contribute to these perspectives. I work with a more affluent white population and I hear this perspective a lot. I will say at the time you said this, I don't know exactly which perspective you were referring to because I didn't see the chat until just now. I'm sorry, Emmy. I will give like the overall response, which is like quite a lot and probably pretty predominantly. And that's why in our interviews, we are often really we're not just asking people like, what do you think? Particularly because we have found that what people just ask people what you think, and this is not just us, is not a particularly fruitful way to get actual perspectives from people. But we actually ask people like about like when they've heard about something and when they started to develop their opinions. And we really kind of ask the narrative approach that gives us a lot more information than like just what do you think? Because I mean, you ask me what I think about any given thing, I don't know, right? Like, I probably don't have a super coherent answer for you. Yeah, so quite a bit. And yeah, I think particularly when we talk about individualism and egalitarianism, I don't do this research, but there are some people who have looked at how different experiences with parenting, different experiences in an elementary school, like kind of create different ideas for people about like the relative weight of like individual choices versus structural choices. Now, again, some people would argue that those are not in conflict, right? Those are not in conflict perspectives, but they're often presented as being such.
Other questions? Richard, could you tell us more about who was in your survey? I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been. I was surprised that it was like 80 to 90% were likely to support.
Yeah.
Like, do you have like a unique sample? Do you feel like it's representative?
So, so all political research has this problem of like I mean, generally speaking, you know, a lot of political research, particularly political polling, has this aim of like representing the American population, which is really important, right? When it comes to like voting and all of that. That said, most of us can't actually do that. And I would say this is true of like everywhere, right? So if you look at Pew, Gallup, like we do our best, you know, kind of with the data we have and a lot of kind of like back end statistical stuff to be able to kind of do our weighted estimates to be more representative for the population. But, you know, we're working with what we have. And if you've read any of like the recent political research, it's getting a little harder, like quite a bit harder over time to do this well. So for this sample, these are of people who, these are, you know, the Prolific is the platform we use, is one of these survey platforms that regularly like engages, recruits people to take surveys. Compared to the US population, on average, Prolific itself, like say MTurk or any given college sample, tends to lean a little bit more liberal, as you can see kind of from our descriptive, tends to lean a little bit younger, but that 80 to 90% of somewhat likely or more is still that still shakes out about that way when we wait for these characteristics that we know make our sample not an exact reflection of the American public. Though, of course, the problem with all of these is that regardless of what you can wait for in terms of demographics, at the end of the day, you are getting people who are more likely to like share their opinion with you in general. And so these are the people who more than likely are going to want to say they're going to participate in politics, because this is a participation in and of itself. Right? The people who do not care at all are just not going to take the survey. Which is to say, this is probably an upper bound, which, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything
Other
else?
questions?
I have a question. So it kind of sounds like the whole interview process itself almost worked like an intervention, so to speak. So I was curious if you have any interest or plans in like designing an intervention in this space and what that might look like.
Yeah, so one, for the existing interviews we have, I mean, part of the thing is that there's like so many things going on in this study that like we can't do all the analysis in this one. So we have some planned future analysis. And one of these is for those people where it appeared to act as an intervention already without us actually designing it that way at all, is to do like a specific analysis on those folks, right? To kind of see what happened there. And that doesn't require us collecting any new data. But the new data thing we hope to do that is more intervention oriented, though not kind of like typical orientation intervention, but intervention oriented, is taking some of these old folks, people who participated in our study, and recruiting some new folks, and doing another interview with them. And this is kind of what I was talking about at the end, which is where this interview is very much framed around like, this is what we have now found from, you know, we are researchers, we have kind of like done these interviews with people across the spectrum, you know, this is what we have found for people who may disagree with you. We'd love to get kind of like your perspective on what you think about this, right? And that is kind of our first step as intervention. And then very much down the road, once we see kind of how this works out, and I'm actually kind of, this is not a secret at this point, but like I'm moving positions to another institution. And one of the things that I hope to be able to do, because I will have access to this at the other institution, is to then design like political dialogue group interventions to see how the tools that we have developed over the course of these interviews, as well as the content knowledge we have developed over these course of interviews, enables for people to have like facilitated conversations about these policy issues that enable them to like actually touch on some of these things in a shared space and maybe kind of come to a better understanding of equity and justice.
That sounds really interesting. I would be with some of my family members. I'd be really interested in some of those, some of those tools.
Yes, though, as I tell all of our students, I wouldn't recommend trying what we're doing on your mom just yet. We're still trying to figure it out.
I have like a weirdly related question, but also I feel like it's a qualitative question. And so I'm very much out of my field here, so to speak. But so kind of going off of Emmy's initial comment and then Jen's question just now about interventions, when you dig into those three perspectives you presented toward the beginning, right? Particularly the last one, the egalitarian perspective. Is there, I don't know if like you've discovered this in your interviews and in your research, if this is like clearly known in these fields of social psychology and things, but like how are there like, I mean, there is heterogeneity within that category, right? Like there's people who will say that perspective, right, so to speak, like give an example, whatever you want to point to, but they'll have very different reasons for it. And you mentioned that, but also it's like there seems to be more or less malleability in perspective, right? Like there are some folks who just like straight up, right, you bring up race against it, right? Like, or like there's others who may have more nuanced conversation if they reach the same conclusions. Did you notice any of that in your research? And is that something that's already known? Is that something that would inform things like designing interventions down the road?
Absolutely. And so answering those backwards, that's a big field within political psychology, which is how to change people's opinions and do they change? And particular, like, you know, the same thing in ed policy. Can you change people's opinions? Do they change and under what circumstances? Right. And, you know, so that's definitely a thing. Red Losk and others have some pretty cool like lab experience in this area. So how to answer this? So the first thing is that of the perspectives in the literature, yes, there's quite a lot of conversation about how these things are developed and how they change, right? Particularly one of the most like common interventions people try are one of two things in this particular space. One is just like exposure to information, which is like, you know, we're all in education. It's the education tack, which is like, if you just teach people things, like how well does that work? How well does it work? Largely, we have found that it does not tend to work particularly well for people who already feel very strongly. And in fact, for people who feel very strongly, you present with them with information, they may go the opposite direction, right? Whereas for people who maybe don't feel as strongly, there's quite a bit more malleability here. And this is part of what we did find in our study with some of the ambivalent groupings, right? The people who are like, I don't really know, you could kind of observe over the course of the interview, like they were changing. And here I'm going to bring in not only this study, but the study that we're doing that has like a pretty identical design on the rights of transgender students. We have plenty of people that like they came in pretty hot with like what we would consider to be like a symbolic perspective about like not really being comfortable with trans people and all of this, and just like over the course of it, like having like for themselves like introduce themselves to other ways of thinking over it, ended up kind of changing their perspective at the end, or making different connections between different areas of their cognitive thinking. So for example, we have multiple Black individuals who were very anti kind of the participation of trans girls in sports, but then over the course of it, as we asked things about, you know, identity and all of that, started to link what they understood about like the experience of being Black to the experience of being transgender, and by the end started to feel more sympathetic, but having made that connection themselves. And then kind of on the other side of the spectrum, there's also like more direct contact theories, you know, more just about people's experiences with diversity. The more you hang out with people who don't look like you, right? Like, how does that like change kind of your sympathy for people's perspectives? You know, it's like intergroup contact theory, which is, as I understand it, like one of the larger predictors, more consistent predictors of people's attitudes towards, say, LGBT politics. It's just like, do you know gay people, right? So, so there's that. Regarding kind of next steps, yeah, in terms of designing interventions, we would have to, that we plan to employ those kind of theoretical frameworks to organize which research questions we ask, because the research question can't be how do we change people's minds, right? We're gonna have to try out like specific things, and those specific categories tend to be information, interpersonal contact, et cetera. And so we kind of try them iteratively. But one of the things that's not tried a whole bunch, and in my perspective, I think it's just because there's been a lack of like interest in this particular area, and also it's really hard to study, is dialogue, right? Like there are a ton of dialogue programs. Some of you may be trained in dialogue, but a lot of them aren't particularly like research grounded as well as much as like a lot of other political interventions. I think it's somewhat of a function of interest among like people who study these things, and also it's just like harder and it takes more time, right? Like for any of you who are like trained in intergroup dialogue, like that training is like a full semester of like showing up for an hour a week, right? Like I'm trained in conflict dialogue, and like I was like, what, 800 hours of training, right? And so it's one of those things where it's like, I do think that there's a little bit of a barrier to people investigating the things that probably have some of the biggest impact. But that's my perspective.
Very interesting. Are there any other questions for Dr. Blissett before I hog up the last time?
I just wanted to take time just to say thank you. One thought that just comes to mind is looking at have you thought about looking at maybe age groups and comparing age groups to your study? And
yeah, we have, so part of the reason I really like the way we do our work is because we do it as a lab, right? Like it's pretty democratic in terms of like how we all work with each other. And we have one student who is particularly very interested in that question, and we had the data, so he took a look. Regarding the quantitative stuff, we didn't find that much of a utility of age in there, though, you know, that could be a function of many things, but we didn't find a ton of utility in age as a part of the model. We didn't take it out, obviously, but like, you know, it wasn't a strong predictor. That's what I'm trying to say. And regarding the qualitative interviews, again, you know, we'd have to do it more systematically were we to do it as a full research study, but he kind of took a look and came back and reported like not really finding that like people who are like older versus younger felt very differently about this in terms of like how they felt on one side or the other. You know, certainly I think language was very different, and he was noting that particularly like the words they chose to use to explain what they were talking about were quite different, but like the perspectives that differentiated the two groups were relatively similar across age groups. But again, that, you know, in a qualitative sense, you wouldn't want to like use that as a way to like rule out age as a predictor, because that's not the point. But at least it's at a narrative point level. Not sure yet.
I have one really quick question to end us. Do you anticipate that current events are going to, like, how are you going to deal with current events as you design like this new study, right? Like what, like as soon as 2024 presidential election starts, I mean, this stuff is already in the news like a lot, so maybe it won't change that much, but I always feel like with every election cycle, there's peaks and troughs, right? Like,
Yeah.
Does that matter?
It does, but yeah, I mean, one, like this is not new, right? Like this kind of thing we're going through is not new. I mean, I do think there are new things about it, but like certainly like the ideologies that are leading people to behave in this way are not new. Yeah, if you're looking for an example of like the most recent time we had like a national kind of outcry over a very similar thing, look at Tucson's Mexican American Studies program, right? And kind of the ban that happened on that back in 2016. And you found like a lot of very similar discourse happening around that time. And so the first thing to kind of point out is that like whether or not this is a current event is questionable, right? Because this is like an underlying part of American politics always. However, what I do think is different now is that those who would seek to oppose race consciousness are way more organized than they have been in the past. I think there's a lot more like a kind of political cohesion. One of the things we've noted within our research group, which we're trying not to make too much of it yet, just because frankly, we just need to take a little bit more time with it before we say anything definitively. But we are noticing that like the people who are like pro these bans, whether or not it's trans rights or CRT, just like have more to say in terms of like the depth of like the various opinions they have, which is attributable to like the fact that like those organizing that side of the movement like just have put out a lot more resources, whereas anyone resisting that movement, we don't really have a coalescing force at all, right? Like sure, AERA put out a statement or something like that, but one, it was real long. And like, you know, we don't really have like a really cohesive like political strategy. And so in terms of like predictions, I am worried, right, about like kind of the lack of coherent counter movement that we are seeing. I mean, certainly we're trying ourselves in just education policy, but you know, it's not as cohesive as we might think. In terms of how we're dealing with it, you know, my hope is that we can continue to deal with it by creating more spaces for dialogue, right? By continuing to be active. Certainly we're researchers, right? And so like, you know, one of our main theories of action is by doing better research, we can do better. But we hope to always be doing this cycle of what some of you all have brought up of like, what have we learned here? How can we like test this out in spaces where people really are, to see whether or not like this is an avenue to explore for like helping our democracy work better, right? In a way that is like more caring of people. And, you know, we largely see like equity and justice as being fairly like rational within the context of justice. I mean, within the context of democracy, that like if people engage with their democracy better, they'd be able to be like more supportive of equity. But, you know, today's a runoff election here in Georgia, and like we don't even get the day off, right? And so like just like really basic things about like the space that people get to engage with democracy are like not great, and we hope to kind of advocate for those.
Well, really fantastic, Dr. Blissett, and thank you so much for sharing the lunch hour with us and talking a little bit about your work and, you know, your future kind of endeavors. I really enjoyed it. I know I got multiple messages from students who had to duck out a little bit early of how riveting this was. So thank you again. For everyone else, this recording will be posted if you want to revisit any of Dr. Blissett's materials. And I hope you will join us as we start back up again in the spring on January 10th during the lunch hour for our first kickoff for spring for the expanded brown bag series. Thanks again, everyone. And I hope you all have a great winter break and great end of your semester.
And I should also say that you have my email. If people want to reach out, feel free to do so.
Yep, absolutely. Great.
All right.
Have a good one, everyone.
All right.